Good morning, everyone. My name's Andrew Shirley. I'm Chief Surveyor with the CLA, and I'm chairing the webinar this morning. I suppose the first thing is, why is devolution so important for the rural economy? And I think it's quite an exciting time we find ourselves in, because not only has the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act passed into law, but that sort of drives focus on mayors, combined authorities, and local government reorganisation. But also, of course, as will have escaped no one's attention, there is going to be a change of Prime Minister. And Andy Burnham has set his stall out right from the beginning on devolution in probably a greater way than perhaps the current Prime Minister. So there's quite a lot of excitement out there. But from our point of view, I think all of our point of view, it needs to work for the rural area. So that's why this is actually a very important seminar and very well timed. Just a few words about the CLA. We are the Country Land and Business Association. We represent the interests of 26,000 rural business members. Some of those are agricultural, some of them are tourism businesses, and mostly diversified businesses. We are all rural, which is really the focus of the webinar today. This is the agenda we're working to, and I will just move on to the next page, which gives some details about the speakers. Dr. Charles Trotman is the CLA Senior Economist, and he has followed the devolution agenda for longer than most of us would care to think about, not just current devolution, but also previous attempts of governments over, Lord only knows, the last 20 years probably. And then we'll follow on to Councillor Nick Ireland and Dr. Catherine Howe, who both are from Dorset Council, the leader and chief executive. And they sort of will talk about Britain's Leading Edge, which is an advocacy group representing 13 local authorities who have no major urban centres. So actually they're important in driving the rural agenda, or perhaps a purely rural agenda. So between them, they will set the scene of the direction as we want to see it. Just a word on sort of general management. If you've got any questions that you would like answered, can you put them in the Q&A button there, and then we'll see them. If you can avoid using the chat, that's quite helpful. It just helps us get all the questions in one place, and therefore we can marshal those and either answer them at the end of this webinar, or we can send answers later. But it's easier to capture on the Q&A. Okay, I will now hand over to Dr. Charles Trotman.
Many thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. As Andrew said, we're going to be talking about devolution, how devolution will impact the rural economy and rural areas. So in the presentation I'll be giving, we'll be looking at developments on devolution, the bill itself, and how the bill progressed through Parliament before it became an act, as well as CLA engagement with local authorities. I'll also be looking at why devolution is vitally important for rural, and raising the issue of guidance to local authorities, how local authorities look at and deal with rural affairs. Next slide, please, Andrew. So if we look at the concept of devolution, the actual what devolution is, it's important to realise that essentially it's a flow of powers from central government to local government. If devolution is to work properly and effectively, it means that local decision makers must be granted more powers and more responsibility to provide public services, as well as engage with rural businesses. And I think the important element here is engagement with those who are actually on the ground. but we also need to understand how devolution can actually help the rural economy. Next slide, please, Andrew. Now, why does devolution matter? So really, devolution should lead to better local decisions. Local leaders will often understand local needs certainly far better than national departments because they're actually there on the ground. I'd say secondly, it leads to clearer accountability. Elected mayors, for example, can actually be held responsible by the voters for strategic choices in their area. It'll lead to stronger local economies. Devolved powers can support joined up action on areas such as transport, skills, regeneration, and housing. And I think finally, it leads to more joined up services. Devolution can encourage councils, mayors, businesses, colleges, and public services to actually work together in the public interest. And that's why it is so important to rural. Next slide, please, Andrew. And that's what we're going to look at now. What does it actually mean for rural? For rural affairs or rural areas, devolution can be especially important because many rural challenges we know are shaped by distance, they're shaped by sparsity, smaller populations, and higher cost of delivering services across large geographic areas or large geographies. Now, if you have a transport plan or a housing strategy or skills program, that works well in a city or an urban area, it may not actually work in the same way for a village or a market town or a coastal community or even a remote rural area. Now, if devolution is done well, it gives rural places a stronger opportunity to shape decisions around their own economic strengths and everyday needs. This can include farming and food production, land-based businesses, tourism, clean energy, market town regeneration, rural transport, and access to housing that local people can actually afford. But I think one of the key elements that we'll come to is that rural proofing, which is a concept designed by government that ensures that all policies, whether it be in a rural setting or in an urban setting, they have to take into account rural interests and they must be applied to devolved strategies, funding decisions, as well as delivery plans. This means checking whether policies will work for dispersed communities, whether the funding available actually reflects rural costs, and whether data that's collected is detailed enough to actually show rural need. If we look at this in practical terms, rural devolution should mean that rural communities, parish and town councils, and those that make up those communities, the farmers, landowners, the public, and rural businesses, as well as voluntary groups and local service providers, they have meaningful roots into decision making. And that's key. What we're talking about here is local decision making. And it also should mean that strategic authorities treat rural areas not only as places with service challenges, which no doubt we all know that they have, but as places with major economic, environmental, and community assets. Next slide, please. So if we look at government objectives, we know that the government wants to make the provision of public services more efficient. That's a standard, but also they want them to make that provision cheaper. It means, as far as the government is concerned, that the structure of local government will change considerably, and we'll see this when we look into the bill and ultimately the act. It'll also mean that certain tiers, as we know, such as district councils, will either be removed or absorbed into other bodies. And of course, as Andrew has rightly said, the politics have changed. Now we're about to have a Prime Minister who has put devolution at the top of his agenda. Next slide, please. So if we look at the stages of devolution, and I think it's important to stress that devolution isn't done in one step. It's an evolved, phased approach. So where we are today, stage one, we have the current state of play with metro mayors, some strategic authorities, and a number of combined authorities and unitary authorities. Stage 2, over the next couple of years, there are a number of priority areas the government has focused on, such as Cheshire and Warrington, Cumbria and Sussex, for example. They'll go to strategic authority or mayoral authority status over those next 2 years. And then we come to stage 3, which are proposed spatial development areas. These are new. They've only just come out and the detail is still to be confirmed. But again, it shows that this is a gradual process. And it also shows that as far as the CLA is concerned, it means that our engagement has to be wide as well as targeted. It's essentially a policy and resource conundrum that we're needing to deal with. Next slide, please. So if we look at the bill itself, let's turn to the politics of this. I think the one striking point to make is that although the bill itself is 329 pages long, and we also had the guidance notes were just as long as that, there is not one mention of rural. Now, that could be a case that the government may have just slipped the government's mind, or the government didn't consider it to be a focal point or an area of interest. But what it did mean at that particular time was that mayors, for example, had no legal responsibility to take into account rural or rural interests. It also meant that communities and businesses could be overlooked for funding and resources. I mean, you could actually say this was a very big risk to take. Next slide, please. Now, this comes on to the lobbying approach that we had to undertake. Now, the CLA did not do this on its own. We actually had to get rural on the face of the bill, and we needed to build coalitions with external bodies, such as the Rural Town and Planning Institute, and propose amendments. And one such key amendment was on clause 2 of the bill under the area of competence. We needed friends and we needed them quickly. And this is why it led to us using our existing coalitions with bodies such as the NFU and CPRE and the Rural Services Network, for example. It also meant we needed to make a big push with peers in the House of Lords so that they could see the importance of rural affairs as that area of competence. But as we know, the government, with its large majority, rejected the first attempt at a Lord's amendment, believing that it wasn't necessary, believing that the other competences, and there were 7 originally, would actually cover rural and rural needs. However, and I think this is where the link comes in, without a legal obligation, rural proofing in practical terms is actually toothless. And to give DEFRA its due, it began lobbying on MHC or G and its build team to get rural affairs recognised, and it did a very, very good job. Next slide, please. So we come down to the final act. We recognise that the importance of parliamentary ping-pong between the Lords and the Commons was going to be absolutely fundamental. And we knew that government could be flexible because in the process leading up to this stage, just before royal assent, we saw a major government concession, which was to agree to strategic authority to actually appoint 10 commissioners rather than the proposed 7. And that was actually key because it gave us a way in. So in this sense, it would mean that a rural commissioner, for example, was a real possibility if we could get rural as an area of competence. But again, as in all politics, and particularly in the politics of rural areas, it was still a risk. Now, of course, we know the government reversed its position, and the Act that received royal assent on the 29th of April includes rural affairs as an area of competence. Next slide, please. Now, this slide sets out those 9 areas of competence. As you'll see, there are 2 new ones, culture and rural affairs. And I think it's important to important point to make that all these competencies are key elements of the government's industrial strategy, and we can't see that changing anytime soon, even with a new Prime Minister and a new administration. I think it's also important to note that within the Act itself, there is a clause in there giving strategic authorities, for example, the right to request powers from central government. One further point is that central government does need to issue guidance to local authorities as we move through the devolution agenda. For rural affairs, this will be non-statutory guidance. As an organisation, we've pushed DEFRA that there needs to be full consultation with external stakeholders, so we make sure that we get this right, because that guidance will be absolutely key. And I think it's also important to stress that we need to ensure that the competencies that we've already listed and we're looking at are linked together, and that the relationships between all of them work effectively, because that is going to be absolutely central to move devolution forward, to make sure that the benefits of devolution can actually be reflected in rural areas. Next slide, please. Now, one of the difficulties and one of the conundrums that we've all often faced is what is actually a definition of rural affairs, and it's actually quite a wide definition. I think if we look in statistical terms, a rural area is defined as a geographic area with a population density of less than 10,000. So the areas listed here essentially explain the breadth of the sector, and this is where we need to have some traction. Of course, there are linkages in each area, and rural proofing, as far as the government is concerned, is a means of pulling policy together. So if we look at policy in, let's say, transport or infrastructure, when policy is actually drafted, it will need to take into account rural interests, rural policies, and rural priorities at the initial stages of drafting. It's no good doing this at the later stages, because it's been put to the back burner. It needs to be done right at the beginning in order to make sure that we don't have a situation of unintended consequences. And again, this stresses the point I've just made, that the competencies themselves have to link together. And it means that there has to be a relationship between all competencies. Next slide, please, Andrew. So let's look at local government reorganisation. Devolution and the government's approach will be delivered. We now know that, primarily because of the new PM, who will be Andy Burnham. But I think it's also interesting to note it's incredibly ambitious. And as far as I'm concerned, this is probably the most radical shake-up of local government since the Local Government Act of 1972. It means new bodies, new powers, and new responsibilities. So let's have a look at what these new bodies might actually be. Next slide, please, Andrew. So we start with strategic authorities. Really, as the name suggests, strategic authorities provides that necessary strategic direction of policy. Decisions will be made through cabinet decision making, not usually through a committee structure. Guidance will be needed on the appointment of commissioners. I don't think there is any doubt about that. And I think the most common solution would be a commissioner for each area of competence, who is advised by a board or an economic development committee. And that's the key goal as far as the CLA is concerned, is that we need to push for rural commissioners and rural economic development committees made up of rural businesses and external stakeholders who can advise, because we've seen in the past when government has tried to put these new structures in place, they can lead to policy vacuums, and we can see how damaging that can be, and we don't want that to happen again. Next slide, please, Andrew. So let's quickly turn our attention to combined authorities. This is where one or more councils rather join together to form a combined authority. So we've got examples such as the North East Combined Authority or the West of England Combined Authorities, and they have powers over a range of policy areas, and they return the right to request additional powers from the Secretary of State. And again, that's an important cog in the whole structure of this new local government model, you could say. Next slide, please, Andrew. Unitary authorities will be responsible for the day-to-day provision of public services. They'll link into the system, the new system that will be created. And of course, these public services include education and social services. But I think the important thing is, how does this all fit together? How does it actually work in practice? I live in Sussex, so let's have a look to see how Sussex will be reorganised. Next slide, please, Andrew. So if we look at Sussex as a case study, at the moment there is West Sussex as a county council, East Sussex as a county council, and Brighton and Hove Council as a city unitary authority or a city council. But in May 2028, Sussex will become a mayoral authority. So essentially, West and East Sussex join together and they elect a mayor. East Sussex becomes one unitary authority. West Sussex will become two unitary authorities. There's still arguments as to whether it would be a north-south divide or a kind of east-west divide. A lot depends on population density. And Brighton and Hove, which is the largest density in Sussex, stays as a city unitary authority. So by May 28, it will become a completely new structure. District councils will be absorbed into unitary authorities. Importantly, town and parish councils will stay as they are. And in Sussex, they have already created the shadow strategic authorities. So plans have been pushed forward to make sure that by May 28, everything is in place for Sussex to be a mayoral authority. And that will be the model of how devolution will take place and how local government will be reorganised. Next slide, please. So what is the role of the CLA in all of this? Now, we recognise we have a lot to do. And of course, I'm particularly pleased with today's publication of the government report on the future of rural England, because that stresses the importance of devolution and rural proofing. We know that the level of understanding of rural at the local level definitely needs to improve, and that has to be the primary objective of CLA policy. Once we're able to increase that knowledge base, then local decision making can finally and fully take into account rural interests. It'll mean that we need to target those strategic authorities that are already in place, such as North Yorkshire, and a series of what we call priority strategic authorities, such as Suffolk and Norfolk and Cambridgeshire. And of course, if we look at North Yorkshire, that's just launched its own rural action plan, which I believe is going to be a big and a major bonus, and it gives us essentially a kind of template to move forward with. I think the other point to make is that the CLA is already influencing and providing leadership for external stakeholders, which will be crucial in developing the right decision-making structures. And I think it's important that, given the breadth of devolution, that we are all able to come together and make this work, that we're all able to come to common positions. Now, we're already in contact with a number of mayoral authorities. We've been meeting the mayors over the last few months because that provides us with an opportunity of understanding their policy priorities. And to give you an example, we recently met with Luke Campbell, who's the mayor of Hull in East Yorkshire. Useful, interesting meeting because it gave us a flavour of their priorities and their interest in rural. And now we have an opportunity, along with other external stakeholders, to actually make a difference and make sure that Hull and East Yorkshire take into account rural interests and rural priorities. Next slide, please. So, as I say, we've got the direction of CLA policy. We'll be developing that further. With CLA as an organisation, we have 5 English regions. They'll take the lead in engagement, but they'll take the lead under guidance from London. But necessarily, because they're a regional team and they've got boots on the ground, they'll directly engage with local authorities. And I think it's important that they do that. Although we may have national goals, we may have national missions, it's the local people on the ground who actually understand the local agendas and actually know the local issues. And as we've said before, local problems need to be resolved through local solutions. Now, CLA already has 5 devolution missions covering decision making, planning, housing, skills, and local economic plans. More will come, including digital connectivity, tourism, and energy. Next slide, please. And what I've explained and run through so far, it means a new form of decision making, and that's really made very clear in the Devolution and Community Empowerment Act passed this year. It's where it's going to focus on a form of cabinet government with portfolios being allocated to elected members. This is why commissioners will be important, as they'll be members of the strategic authorities cabinet. So this will mean that the rural affairs area of competence, which we fought so hard to get in, should have its own commissioner in those strategic authorities with a significant rural hinterland. And we take the view that a rural commissioner needs to be assisted by what we call a Rural Economic Development Committee made up of external stakeholders, because it's through this we can ensure that policies and decisions fully reflect rural interests, either directly or indirectly. It's about actually bringing together the whole, making everything linked together. And we can also extend this to other subsectors and other policies, such as greater communication between landowners, for example, and local authorities or strategic authorities involved in local nature recovery strategies. So to make this work, it's got to be simple, it's got to be a straightforward process, and everybody has to play their part. Next slide, please. So let's look at next steps. As far as the CLA is concerned, we continue to liaise with our regions and provide them with as much support as possible from London. Obviously, we will continue to liaise and assist government as we have so far. And I think what's essentially the best thing to come out of this whole process is we now know that clear dialogue and full engagement actually does work. CLA, along with other rural organisations, will be involved in extensive engagement with the mayoral campaigns that will take place in Cheshire and Warrington and Cumbria in May 2027. It also means that we really need to bring together the other external stakeholders so that we have a collective whole, so that we can agree common positions as well as joining resources. And I think importantly, now that we've secured rural affairs as an area of competence, we've now got rural proofing set. It provides us all with an opportunity to lead and develop policy that meets the needs of rural businesses and rural communities. And as an organisation, the CLA will be an integral part to devolution, and along with everybody, make it work in everybody's interests. Thank you very much. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Charles. Anything that you've listened to from Charles, please don't hold back on asking questions in the Q&A, and we'll deal with those at the end of the presentations. I'll now hand over to Councillor Nick Ireland, who leads Dorset County Council, and their Chief Executive, Dr. Catherine Howe, who will talk about Britain's leading edge.
Thanks, Andrew. And just to correct you,
it's
Dorset Council, it's not County Council.
I'll beg your pardon.
That's okay. It's okay. I'll let
habits.
Catherine introduce herself when she speaks, which is I think is around about slide 6. But myself and Catherine, Dorset Council, I'm the leader. It's a Liberal Democrat majority administration, and we're here to talk about Britain's leading edge and why it's really important not to ignore rural communities. So if we go to the next slide. So Britain's leading edge, many of you are probably going, what is that? It says on the screen what we are. So it was created back in 2019. Basically, Cornwall sort of led on it back in the day, but it was in recognition of the fact that we are essentially ignored in many ways in terms of funding, in terms of investment. So that was set up in 2019. We do have special interest group status with the LGA. We are, the geography is there on the screen, it's the green bits, in case it's not obvious, and the names of the councils are there. We are varying political leadership, so we're all pretty much every single political colour in terms of leadership of councils. We are, just following on from Charles's presentation, a mixture of various types of authorities. So we do have districts, we do have upper tier, Some of us have MERS, some of us don't. Don't get me started on devolution. But essentially, we are a mixed bag. But the thing we do have in common is that we are predominantly rural, and we have no major urban centres. Essentially, we don't have any cities. We do have. So most of us have population centres above 10,000, but the vast majority of our patches are rural. We do have informal relationships with the CLA, for example, and the RSN, which was Charles has mentioned. And I probably should just say, I guess we're trying to push, and you'll see this in the slides, and we do have a shorter slide deck, but we're not just a nice place to go on holiday. I've discussed this with Catherine before. Our backgrounds imply it is, and it is, but we're a lot more than that. And I think we need to press and make that obvious. So next slide, please. So this slide is basically, I won't read the slides out, but basically the government's new 10-year industrial strategy, it's positive, and it's an ambitious framework for driving national growth. And it promotes 8 priority sectors, some of which are immediate relevance to BLE. And one of the things, or several of the things we push on are defence, renewable energy, and also agri-tech. And the core objectives of the strategy are laudable, but there is a risk that the emphasis on city regions and established clusters overlooks the untapped potential of our rural and coastal areas. And the LGR announcements today, there were land grabs by cities, so it's really important there are voices out there, not basically sucked up by places like Exeter, if I can be political. So growth should not be viewed slowly through an urban lens, which is basically what I've just said. So rural and coastal communities, we have assets, we definitely have the skills, we have the businesses, and we also have the natural resources that can contribute to national priorities, and we can deliver good, inclusive growth, and that's really important within a network of places, rather than concentrating the benefits in a small number of cities and urban areas. And with Andy Burnham coming on board, he's saying all the right words about devolution, but we really want him to notice that we are out there and not concentrate on the cities that he knows well. So the industrial strategy can deliver truly inclusive and sustainable growth by recognising coastal places as part of that solution. And in so doing, we can help transform the fortunes of places that otherwise risk being left behind and arguably have been in the past. So if we go on to the next slide. Just to re-emphasise, this is about what we can do. So we do host key infrastructure, but there's a clear national imperative and advantage to actually unlocking our rural potential. So we make essential contributions to several of the government's key priorities. So in defence, BLA regions are vital to our national security. So we host key defence infrastructure. We've got military, naval, air force bases. We have training grounds, critical defence manufacturing sites. And we also, we are strategically located in terms of national importance. Our communities contribute to emergency response. We contribute to cyber defence and resilience, often in ways that are overlooked in national policy. We've also got huge potential in energy. We already generate nearly 17,000 gigawatts of renewable energy in 2024. We've generated more this year, and obviously the weather this year, lots of solar output. But we have the potential to be so much more, especially in this government has railed back and allowed a lot more offshore and especially onshore wind. For example, we've got huge potential in offshore wind because of our locations, and the picture shows it all. We've got room to grow. So next slide, please. So this is my last one before I hand over to Catherine. So the other things we focus on, and we bang the drum, for the want of a better phrase, is food security. The major proportion of UK agriculture, fishing and forestry business is, unsurprisingly, given that we're rural, is in our regions. And also we are the lungs of the UK. So the UK imported nearly 40% of its food in 2023, and it's recognised that needs to be improved. I don't think we'll ever produce all our own food, and we never have done. But developing better domestic resilience, especially in line of the things that have been happening around the world, Ukraine, Iran, it's really important that we do. We need investment in research, automation, and focus on resource efficiency. They'll help achieve our full output. It's really important that we use the land we've got to be the best it can, and in a sustainable way, I'll add. That doesn't mean intensive farming, because rural communities are actually custodians of our green spaces as well. So they're not only important to environmental health, but also mental and physical well-being, obviously, of residents and visitors alike. Our landscapes do support active travel, although we could do a lot more, and things like devolution and those will give us, where we haven't got it already, strategic authorities and mayoral funding will give us advantages in terms of making that happen. We offer opportunities for walking, cycling and outdoor activities that improve public health and also reduce emissions, of course. And we also store carbon and cool our cities and towns, making increasingly important. With climate change is happening. My office here is ridiculously hot. I don't have air conditioning, and this is going to change. This is going to get worse. So we have lots to offer is my message, and I'll hand over to Catherine to emphasise that.
Brilliant, thank you, Nick. So as Nick said, I'm the Chief Exec of Dorset Council, and we support Britain's Leading Edge as the Secretariat. As is often the case, the Chief Executive gets to tell you the bad news while the leader gets to tell you the good news. It was ever thus. And I think the rural snapshot here is, rural authorities consistently do worse around funding. And what that does is puts one hand behind our back in terms of realising the potential of what you see on this slide, is that we are already a massive contributor to the economy, but there is an enormous productivity boost that could be put in place with the right kind of funding. And so in terms of how you might apply a force multiplier effect to the economy, arguably the things that you would do in a rural location with a polycentric economy are actually a lot simpler than how you squeeze extra pips out of urban areas. And there's something about the underlying model of assuming that the kind of the aggregation effect that you get from the funding model as we experience at the moment, that just doesn't work unless you put in some adaptation around the funding that we need in order to counter remoteness. If we go on to the next slide, you'll start to see even more kind of like some of the unevenness of this, and it's a bit of a chaotic map, but it illustrates things like median salary ranges. It illustrates the low end of the scale, and you can see how that leading edge, how we came together as a partnership in terms of those median salaries, and that blue being around those lower bands being around the edge. There's things like only half of rural households are close to hospitals. That compares to 97% of people in urban areas. And it's things like that. If we want to see a left shift in the health service, we have to think much more about place, much more about neighbourhood in our health model, because the model of acute hospitals, which is dominant in the NHS, may work in urban areas. It does not work in places with rural isolation. Things like the journey time to employment centres, things like the lack of high-speed broadband availability. These are all problems that arguably the country has solved in urban areas and has left us to figure out in rural areas. What that is a tremendous opportunity, because those are all problems that we know how to solve, but we need the attention of government and we need real focus together in order to get over the line with that. If we go on to the next slide, and this is the point about the sort of that overlooking of rural coastal areas, and also perhaps government sort of starting to see as problems that need to be solved rather than opportunity that can be tapped into. Is that there's a lot of policy space around mission coastal and around coastal inequality. I think we would like to flip the dial to talk more about coastal potential. Particularly when you start to talk about what the possibility is around offshore wind. And for an area like the Southwest, that's absolutely tremendous. The thing is that these are all win-win opportunities. Is if you remove this deficit that we've got in terms of the way in which government organises itself, the opportunity for growth, and growth which is, as Nick says, inclusive growth, or as Andy Burnham says, good growth in every postcode, is absolutely tremendous. The question for us is, how do we tap into that without actually compromising the quality of life, which is the reason that many people choose to live and to stay in these areas. Next slide, and back to Nick.
Yeah, so just to build on the previous slides, so not only do we host quite a lot of defence infrastructure, basically the Army, Navy and Air Force, as I mentioned, many BLE regions, we support vital defence industries, technologies and supply chains We supply specialist components to advancing space and aerospace capabilities as well. For example, we have a spaceport in Cornwall, which is quite interesting and slightly weird. But we also help sustain UK strategic nuclear deterrence, which relies on long-term collaboration between industry and government, and sustained investment in advanced engineering and workforce skills. So strengthening these place-based capabilities is not only an economic priority, but actually is a matter of national significance. So despite their potential, SMEs in rural and coastal areas, i.e. in our BLA area, were often overlooked in national defence strategies, and we do face barriers to entering the defence sector. Plymouth, for example, get a lot of money. They are part of our group, but they in terms of the southwest, but they filter out to us. But we need more investment and more recognition that lots of small companies. For my own patch, Dorset has no real big employers, for example, but we have lots of really small specialist engineering companies, from 50 to 200 people, who generate a huge amount of high quality, positive jobs and contribute to the economy. So what we're calling for is for government's SME action plan and commercial pathway to be explicitly rural and coastal friendly, so that we ensure that procurement routes, innovation pipelines, and development programs are fully accessible to SMEs outside of major urban centres, and that they aren't ignored. And investment in defence infrastructure, skills, and connectivity in growth regions will bolster UK's overall resilience while creating new opportunities for local economies. So next slide, I'm going to touch on the energy bit. As I mentioned earlier, if you got the devolved powers and funding to fully capitalise on the enormous renewable energy potential of our area, we can and will reinforce UK's future electricity resilience. The only way to get out of this climate crisis is to electrify everything, in my view, and we can be crucial to that. Imports of energy, they're increasingly unreliable with global chaos. Iran has just shown how dependent we are on fossil fuels. And actually, it's had a positive effect in terms of, I think it's really driving the move away from fossil fuels. And you've also got cost of living rises, serious impacts on our businesses, and inflation driven by energy costs. So significant long-term investments in green energy. And the government are doing a lot more than the previous incumbents, but we need to go further. And we need to invest in environmental technology that our industry requires. So we can be in BLE region, we can be wealth creating while help boost our low wage economy. Inclusive growth is really, really important. We need that social mobility. We need good jobs and housing and all that goes along with it. Grid capacity upgrades and connections, they're also critical to unlocking clean energy potential. Many of our councils have issues with grid connections because the focus is on urban centres yet again. So without investment in this infrastructure, rural regions, we just can't contribute because we're basically being, as Catherine mentioned, one hand behind our back. We're being stifled. So we have an offer, and we can, if we're given the opportunity, we can push it through. I think it's back over to Catherine again now for the next one.
And really, with the next slide, building on on that thing about resilience, is that we should be worrying a lot about food security right now, is that we have really kind of unsafe supply chains. The pandemic, wars in the Ukraine, but also climate change means that food inflation is one of our underlying drivers of cost of living, but also it's a question of great instability. Is that we need to be thinking about that domestic production as part of that inclusive growth story. It makes no sense for us to continue to be reliant on an external international supply chain when actually there's the opportunity to grow domestically, which benefits our farmers, but also enriches our environment as well if we do it in the right way. Is that this question about really understanding what do you need to be successful in agriculture is something which Whitehall is largely unsighted on, with the honourable exception of DEFRA, who I know we are very much shoulder to the wheel in terms of supporting, because actually national food resilience mustn't come as a result of environmental cost. We have to be able to balance food security with climate resilience, and you can really only do that with an absolutely integral understanding of the land at which you're doing that. That's one of the bits that rural economies bring into that national picture. We go on to the next slide, and that's because we've got to balance what do we want to use the land for, so because we are also the lungs of the UK. Increasingly, as we look at climate resilience, how we work with our natural landscape is going to be essential. You know, we host critical water catchment areas. We have to invest in these natural assets because our communities want us to and the nation needs us to. So there are clear economic benefits to doing so if we start to think about this as a story of inclusive growth. And there's also, obviously, there's a case around domestic tourism, green tourism, and how we actually give people the opportunity to spend time in these incredible rural spaces. And making that part of the story that we're trying to tell is really important as well. If I go on to Nick.
So Charles touched on devolution and the current landscape of local government and how it's changing. So that map in front of you, it shows our members with the stars and where we currently sit in. Either we've got Wirral, which is the sort of the east coast there. You can see Yorkshire. People on the priority programme, so you got the top left, it's Cumberland, Westmoreland Lake District, if you want to, wherever I don't know what the title is for their name for their FSA, but it's the two unitary authorities, Westmoreland Furness and the other one, and obviously Hampshire down the middle in the bottom, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Lots of it is yellow in dialogue. Some of them are sort of more advanced than others, must be said. And there were announcements today, but didn't mention devolution. It was purely focused on LGR, which is slightly disappointing. But you know, regardless of that, we do welcome government's devolution ambitions because we recognise that they can be transformational for rural and coastal places. So this the CCN, the County Council Network, they've estimated that devolution of public spending can generate up to 26 billion in economic value over 5 years and deliver 11.7 billion in savings. So a study of devolution in Greater Manchester found social benefits to match economic gains. So these are things like improved life expectancy, particularly for those in deprived areas, and we have lots of the deprived areas in our BLA membership. BLA regions have a proven track record of delivering capital projects at scale, driving growth and creating thriving places. You know, one of our patches is Somerset. You know, you've got the largest building site in Western Europe going on with the nuclear power station, and we've got a huge battery factory being built there as well. So we can contribute, but we are underrepresented, I should say, underestimated as well, I suspect, in the government's rollout of local devolution to date. 9 of our 13 members have not been confirmed for a strategic authority status as of yet, and it hasn't changed today. So we call on government to fully implement the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act and match the devolved powers with long-term single-pot funding for all regions, not just major urban centres. So we do stand ready to work with government to deliver the potential of devolution and ask to be directly involved in developing and refining expectations for the new rural and coastal communities competence, which is a thing. So if we go on to the next slide, and we're nearly finished, you'll be pleased to know this is basically the last one. So there was the Local Government Association conference last week, which some of you may have attended. We launched our manifesto last year. It's been quite a bit of work. It builds on the previous one. So we announced it. It's on our website. Please look at it. But it sets out our potential, representing rural, coastal economies and communities, and basically calls for change. It highlights our national dependency on rural coastal places, as we've hopefully got across in the last few slides, particularly for defence, food security, energy resilience and climate change mitigation. And it makes a case for a fair representation of rural and coastal communities in national strategy, policy and economic investment. We also argue that we are different from urban and metro areas. We face different challenges and pressures. It's unique to our geographies, our demographies, our economies. So a one-size-fits-all policy and funding approach does not work for us. It does need to be more sensitive. It needs to be responsive to what our needs are, and that's what we're asking for. So it sets out a number of commitments we're making as a group to pursue the outcomes of our regions and basically watch the space. We are pushing, I think the new government gives us an opportunity, not the new government, the new Prime Minister, but it's essentially a new government if he changes everything he's going to say. And we will be writing to him. He's going to get lots of letters from Monday, I can tell you now. So that's basically the end of our presentation. Happy to take questions. I guess the message is we need to be looked at and we deserve to be. You're on mute, Andrew.
Sorry, thank you very much, Nick and Catherine. I think we'll progress to the question and answer session as quickly as we can. And there is a question in from Bethan, which I think Charles Trotman's going to deal with. Charles, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think it's a really important point to make here is the relationship between external stakeholders and central government, because DEFRA has the responsibility, along with MHCLG, to provide the non-statutory guidance to local authorities. We've already heard that there are major issues and major challenges that face rural areas. But rather than look at the negatives that we, I've been at CLA for nearly 25 years, that I often have to look at, and the challenges that rural areas and rural businesses often face, I see this as a new beginning. In a sense, it's the biggest opportunity that we've ever had to actually deliver and get the government to help us deliver genuine, real rural economic growth. We all know the economic contribution that rural areas actually make to the UK economy. This is the time, the opportunity to actually unlock the potential which we know is there and actually make it count. But we can only do that by maintaining a clear and constructive dialogue with everybody who's involved in the decision-making process, whether they be at local government level, i.e. through BLE members and others, or through central government, through DEFRA, MHCLG and other government departments. And, I've spoken to Bethan on a number of occasions about this. If we can actually make that dialogue constructive, we can make a difference. I think now is the time we've got to make the difference.
Thank you, Charles. Another question which has come in from Emma Paulett, which is sort of talking about the various funding schemes that we've had in the past, whether it's to encourage rural economic growth or it's investment in the environment. We're at a unique point at the moment. So have we actually sort of thought about what we think good looks like for the rural area? And I think probably, should we start with Dorset Council?
Catherine, do you want to take that? That's probably more in
your... So and then my leader will improve on my answer if he wants to. So as the lucky recipient of many misaligned funding streams, I think this is a real challenge. I think this government's done more than most to try and pull funding together, but really it's still under departmental headings. And I think to really get into the question that's being asked here is we need to start to see proper place-based funding being brought together. Now, there's a hope for that in the mayoral authorities, and that's why devolution is a critical part of this. But I also think rural areas exploring things like total place and how do we get into the intricacies of that a little bit better together, I think will make a really big difference. Because I think what becomes really clear is that unless you can align those priorities and policy areas, as you start to measure impact, you're always sort of tugging against each other rather than aligning and making it really work for place. And I think that's actually truer in a rural economy than it is in an urban one.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add. I was going to answer, but it probably links to another question that's already in the chat. So, which is related to funding. So if maybe I just jump onto that. So it's
yes, that'd be good. That'd be good.
I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Bellaby Forbes. Anyway, I apologize. I can't pronounce your name. I've never seen that web name before. So if they are serious about devolution, this is about whether money comes with devolution. And using an example of one of our members that don't get very much money. That is the hope, I think. We do not want to raise local taxes. Many of our members in BLE have the highest council taxes in the country. That's a fact. So I think Dorset, depending on which way you measure it, we are highest or somewhere down. Catherine's got. It depends whether you add PCC and all that sort of stuff on top of it, but we're always up in the top 10. Rutland has been number 1 for a while and then dropped. Who are another our members. those of us who aren't in a strategic authority, we want money that comes with it, is what we want. I might annoy my chief exec at the moment if I say this, but I'm going to say anyway. If government can't impose strategic authorities on us, then they haven't got the power to do so. So, in terms of where we are in Wessex, which is Somerset, Wiltshire, Dorset, and BCP Council, which is not a member of the BLE, we won't accept anything which is going to be to the detriment of our residents, basically. So, and we've told the government that, and hopefully the money will come. In terms of CCA or whatever, increasing housing, I still think the responsibility for housing is still with the unitaries of the upper tier, as they will be. The SDS will drive where it's going to go, and hopefully pull in funding. But I think in the end, it's going to be the local authorities who are going to be building them or trying to get them built.
Yeah, if I may, so I would never disagree with my leader, but I think in the funding, it's going to have to be blended finance. Is that we're going to need to bootstrap some stuff. We're going to need to crowd in inward investment, and we do need to be getting the funding to actually do strategic authorities of whatever nature properly, and that's something which should be a key campaigning point. Is that I think at the moment the tax raising, one would welcome fiscal devolution, but only from a treasury that understands a polycentric economy, whereas because there's a high risk that you end up with fiscal devolution that again works really brilliantly in urban areas but doesn't quite pick up the way that actually you've got a very lumpy economy in a rural region, and redistribution locally is as much of a question as redistribution nationally. So I think it needs sophistication, but I guess partly what we're trying to do with BLE is to say is that clearly we are underpowered in the funding department. But the answer to that is to also point out is that the country is missing out a lot by not solving that problem, but not getting out of our way to solve it ourselves as well. So it's a complex answer, I think.
I think just two more questions, if I can, I suppose, take them together in a way. The first one is around rural proofing generally, which has been around for such a long time. How can we make sure that rural proofing is different this time and really takes place in such a way that it's not just a tick box exercise, but really delivers change? I think probably Britain's Leading Edge has probably got the answer to that. And the second one is, how can CLA members get into the new combined authorities and the mayoral candidates and mayors and really make a difference?
I can give a very quick political answer. So we, in terms of BLE and also in terms of other things we're doing from my perspective down in the Southwest Peninsula, so this Isles Scilly upwards and including up to Gloucester, essentially, we're not waiting for somebody to come over the hill and save us. We do have to consistently and repeat the message that we are here and demonstrate what we can do. And we've done that in the past through the Great Southwest, which was our PRP, which is sadly no longer around, but that hasn't disappeared into the ether. The good work it did is we're carrying forward and we're building on it through Southwest Councils, for example, and BLE. It feeds into what we're doing there as well. So politically, we know we need to do better. We consistently lobby government through our MPs. All our MPs pretty much are on board. Why wouldn't they be? They want what's best for their residents, and that's what we do. In terms of what the CLA can do for us, just reinforce that and say we need to talk to these guys. And I'll stop there and let somebody else answer.
The thing is that what politicians backing, like, so what Nick's saying in terms of politicians backing ourselves. We've got a really great story to tell, is that what that creates for officers is the chance to go in there with a much harder line in terms of sort out the funding. So there's a real partnership here. And I think it is a bit about make the sell exactly as Nick says, but then that gives us power to improve the funding conversation as well. The two things go hand in hand.
Right. Thank you very much. Charles.
Yeah, I think in answer to both questions, and obviously I'm aware of where the difficulties are. So let's start with rural proofing. Martin, yes, I know rural proofing, you could say, has failed. I've been in countless meetings basically banging my fists against a table or on a table and basically saying to government officials, you have not taken rural proofing into account whatsoever, i.e., what is the point in rural proofing? My answer today, however, would be that if central government works with external stakeholders, we can design a mechanism or a series of mechanisms to ensure through devolution that rural proofing can work. As I said, this is the beginning. In answer to Emma's question about what have the mayors done and how do you gain access and traction with the mayors, well, Emma, I can tell you now that we are going to begin a project focusing and targeting Paul Bristow as Mayor of Cambridgeshire to actually maintain and ensure there is proper access and that Mr. Bristow does take into account rural affairs and rural interests. There is now a legal obligation because of the Act, and we'll be making sure that not only Cambridgeshire, but other strategic authorities and mayoral authorities take that responsibility fully and actually are fully aware that they need to act, they need to deliver, because if they don't deliver, they will be held accountable not only by us and other external stakeholders, but also by the general public.
Thank you very much, Charles. We are now 4 minutes past 1. The webinar was an hour long, so I think it is probably time to bid you all farewell. I want to thank everyone that's joined this webinar for their input and their questions. And thank you very much to Charles from the CLA and Nick and Catherine from Dorset Council. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.